We are live. Good morning, Kevin Weaver. I am Jayme Soulati of Soulati Media, and I work with Kevin Weaver in and for an Uprising series. Kevin, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
Things are good. I just played a bunch of tennis, so I'm all raring to go, and I see this wonderful backdrop behind you. So let me stop talking so we can get a glimpse of that. Who's behind you? What's going on back there?
Oh, actually, that's just one of our backdrops for one of our private intensive we just finished. So I was proofing that. It's kind of an overview of a 2-day walk through Reorient Level 3.
Which probably means nothing to anybody, so we're going to backtrack all the way, and we're going to do a good introduction of Kevin Weaver. Kev, tell me about yourself. Tell me what your journey is and what your mission is in life today.
How far back would you like me to go, ma'am?
Oh, my goodness. You know what? I've only had the pleasure of meeting you IRL maybe 6 months ago, so
Right.
you've been on a journey a lot longer than that. So I don't know. Take us through the Reorient book. You're the author of that, and you've got plans for the future, and you're rising up, and just give us a top line of who you are and what you're trying to do.
All right. Well, maybe let me back up, just give you a Cliff Notes version, because I think it's always ironic, a little bit about my upbringing, where I came from with respect to the Reorient mission. It's so funny for me nowadays. People always associate me with Reorient, and which is a words book, and so I often jokingly get introduced as the word guy, the Noah Webster of 2014. But the irony about that is, for me personally, and it's a testament to what God can do and the supernatural endowment of grace that He can provide in our heart to allow us to do something we weren't maybe naturally gifted for. But for me, I grew up in a little town in Indiana, northern Indiana, which I love, but it's actually near one of the smallest actual towns that is a municipality in Indiana. And so grew up there, awesome family. But one of the ironies is that all the way through elementary school, high school, etc., I don't really recall ever taking a book home, per se. And it wasn't until I was in college that I discovered I had maybe not a formal, but somewhat of a learning disability, in that I remembered much more of what I heard than what I read. And so as a result, late into my teens, one of the people that I had respected very well in our community. He was very accomplished attorney. He had 2 daughters, which was my primary interest back then in high school. But anyway, they were actually really good friends. And he had called me over to his house one day, and he said, "Kevin, I love you, and I just love your friendship with my daughters, and I've got high hopes for you in the future, but I've got to talk to you about one thing." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Your use of words is some of the worst I've ever heard. Your vocabulary is the worst I've ever heard. Have you ever read a book?" And ironically, at that time, I had to say no, I hadn't, because I really didn't read a ton. And so he gave me my very first book, and for whatever, it was actually a book by Anthony Robbins, and called Unlimited Power, and that book changed my life. And the point was that I feel like it was the genesis that, whatever, as a teenager, I can't remember the exact year, that it set me on a journey to learning and being really curious. And there's a moment in that book where Tony talks about just the power to choose, that unlike animals, humans have this unique ability to choose. Regardless of what's happening to them, they can choose how they respond. And that was such a huge epiphany for me. And so after that particular book, I became a voracious reader. And so it's so ironic that all these years later, that one of the things that I feel like God would assign me as an individual mission would be the original intent and words. And that's become a passion of mine since, probably for the last 15, 16 years especially, and you'll see why in a moment. But how ironic that a person who late into their teens and early 20s had no grasp of words or vocabulary, that God would use to redefine words in this way. And so one of my greatest pleasures was to send them a Reorient book when it was ultimately finished. And so thank you to my friends in Indiana who believed in me and were honest enough to tell me the truth about my greatest deficiency at the time, right? So.
At which you overcame in spades, might I add. So your mission today, if you could summarize what you're attempting every single day of your life now as a disciple of Jesus, what is your mission for you, your family, your community, your children? tell me about what it is that you're trying to instill upon the world today, Kevin.
Well, I mean, that's a big question, but I mean, for me, first and foremost, my wife and I met 16 years ago in 1998 at an airport in Kansas City, and we were the only two people in a terminal. And a few minutes into that meeting, Michelle said, "Kevin, tell me what your number one passion is in life." And we'd only known each other at that point about 3.5 minutes, so that's a tough question to answer. And I said, honestly, probably just the work I'm doing at that time. I was an entrepreneur, which I had been, kind of a serial entrepreneur for 20 years. No Bill Gates by any means, but a successful small business owner. And so I told Michelle, probably my number one passion is my relationship with God, and number two, just building a business that can make a difference in the world. And so, as fate would have it, at least on the family front, that would be the first encounter with Michelle, and a few weeks later we were on the same flight to New York, and a few weeks later the same flight to Chicago, and a short time after that we were actually together for a weekend in Dallas, and I felt like I heard an audible voice say, "This is your wife, ask her to marry you." And we got engaged at Christmas, married at Easter, and the longest time we ever spent together was our honeymoon, which was 10 days in Israel. But anyway, when I met Michelle, her passion was very similar to mine. Mike Bickle, who married us, would say at the time, it's like two people swallowed the sun and they've been combined together, and that's what Michelle was like. She was, vibrant and like she had swallowed the sun on her face every day. And so we were just laughing yesterday that we had these goofy little Christian shirts back at the time, which didn't have really cool apparel for disciples of Jesus, and so it said Team Jesus on it. And we were just laughing because, that was our passion. We loved God. We felt like, he was very present tense and very approachable and experiential, but she had grown up more in a disciple model. I grew up more, though not directly Catholic, more in a Catholic community. And so God always seemed distant and maybe a bit of a hard taskmaster who was really only concerned with managing my sin in the traditional sense of that word. And so Michelle and I were curious, I guess, to make a long story short. And so when we would hear things or we would hear things taught that we were passionate about God, we always felt like we really needed to search that out. And so it was early on in that experience with Michelle and I that I had the first experience with words. And I had a dream one evening. And in that dream, I was in a room and Jesus stood beside me and he took me into a room and he basically said, I want you to redefine the gospel for this generation. And he gave me 26 words, 9 of which are in the Reorient book, that he totally redefined. And though I say redefined, I would later discover they were actually the original definitions, but they're not usually defined that way today. And so little did we know, all these years later, Michelle and I have been married 16 years, we have 3 children, 12, 10, and 5. And our passion as a family has been, and I hope this would be the fruit of anybody who's met us, is that whatever God was doing us at the time, we wanted to use that to revive other people, and so that they could live fully alive and experientially every day as a present tense reality know that God was really approachable, walking with them, to guide them to realize the highest good for them and for their family, for others that they're encountering. And so in a general sense, that's our primary passion, and Reorient is the first step in more of a public work to help bring that about on a larger scale of something God probably honed in private, for many years.
And that's a great story, Kevin, and so impressive that you found such a soulmate and a partner in Michelle, and you're doing God's work together on an amazing journey and trying to share that journey with so many other people. And I did read the Reorient book, and I had the pleasure of sitting through one of your weekend intensives, which is what you do. You lead people, total strangers, on a very intense weekend together, and you talk about, you teach and you educate and you show the light and the love, and it's so intense. And things happened to me that weekend that I never expected, which we're not talking about today.
When you and I were introduced, I'd ask you what your God grid was, and you said 0. So that was cool that you could go so far and have such a rich experience from ground zero.
You know what? And I think that, so we should talk about that for 2 seconds, because I was so petrified when I first talked with you on the phone. We were introduced by your colleague, and he said we should talk, and we did, and I have to say that you blew me away on the telephone because you were immediately a storyteller, a master storyteller, and it felt like we were old souls, you know. But I was still afraid of you because you have this thing that I have never had in my life, which was, as you so rightly put it, a God grid. And why is that? Because my father is Muslim, my mother is, I think she calls herself agnostic, you know, and I traveled the world and lived in Iran and lived in the States and blah, 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 and went to a congregational church with my grandmother, so I do know the Lord's Prayer. But you know, yeah, it's pretty funny. And I'm a spiritual woman, and I'm such a student. So I consider myself your student. And so you just kind of opened the door for whatever was to come, and things happened to me. And I'll never forget those things, those experiences, I should say. Very personal, very amazing. It was life-changing. And I think it really started my own personal transformation, because after that time, more things began to happen to me on a personal level. I really began this transformation journey, and on my blog and on other guest posts I've written, I share that you know, people who want to, and I've been it's been told to me that I'm a goddess awakening. I really never knew what that meant, but I
awakening.
Pardon me?
A God girl awakening.
God girl awakening with no God grid, but it's coming. You're teaching me. So with that said, because I don't know, people, whoever's going to watch this is going to go, what? Jayme Soulati, that blogger on PR, social media, and business? She's like talking about God and Jesus with this guy. And so I had to give a little, you know, structure to this framework for this conversation. But no, I did read.
It's so cool though, friend, is because, you know, I remember when we first talked, you're like, you know, is this going to be a problem, me helping you with this? And the fact is that the truth is the truth for all things. And, you know, I think even Jesus is the original Superman. And even if you just set aside any discussion about his God nature and just looked at him as a man, as a human who lived, I would challenge anybody to find me a more suitable person to emulate. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you just approached him as a person, it doesn't matter whether initially, in fact, you probably shouldn't have to believe that he's a God. He is God, rather, initially. How could you know that until you got to know him as a person? And so, anyway, it's just so fun for me to watch you experience that and see it without weirdness and without sensationalism and just a pure, unadulterated discovery of it. So, it's awesome.
Yeah. I'm sure, and you see it over and over in these intensives you lead. I'm sure it's so enriching for you to watch the transformations of so many people, and it's such an amazing journey. And you are an amazing fellow, and with Michelle as well, and what you do for so many. And so
people are going to think I'm paying you to say that, so be careful. Stay on topic now, Jayme.
Yes, I know I'm getting off topic, but that's what the beauty of this live stuff is. I can get you, it's like a talk show host. They can ask you whatever the heck, but we're gonna stay on topic because I want to, because we'll have plenty more conversations like this, I'm sure, very deep ones, and we'll start inviting people. But the Reorient book, I don't know, do you have one handy? Can you show the cover real quick?
I do, yeah.
Love to show that to everybody.
This is a very dirty one, but
I can't tell on the screen. So this is Reorient, and this is a book of 9 words that Kevin is redefining and restructuring, if you will, for people to learn a different meaning of 9 words. Is that, and Kevin, you can give a better description than that than I can.
Yeah, that's probably right. I mean, I know when I first pitched the idea to a publisher, you know, about this book. It's the first book in a series of 7, which we'll talk about in a minute. But when I first pitched this idea to a book, they're like, "What? A dictionary? I mean, who would be interested in reading a dictionary?" And it's not a dictionary. It's really, it's amazing that it's 650 pages, about 9 words, which is really what it's about. But it asks the question that what if the meaning that we've assigned to just 9 words have been used to shape approximately 2,000 years of religious tradition and the cultures of the world as we know it? What would be the implications if the meaning that tradition had assigned to those words were wrong? And what you'll discover is, I'm not saying people are wrong, It's just the original intent that we've assigned to these words and wrong. And we have 2,000 years of tradition where all people have been taught is that skewed meaning. And the implications are so far-reaching that it's really mind-blowing. And so that's the premise of the book. But let me back up just a little bit further and describe why, in a very short sense, why this even matters. And it has to do with the supernatural power of a word. And in short, we don't give much thought to it, but because we have so many different languages and we speak and we use words every single day. But just pause for a second and ask yourself the question, what is a word?
Right.
We take it for granted because, again, we use them every day. But words are so powerful. And we'll be doing a much longer, extended version and maybe a future TED Talk on this topic. But it has to do with the supernatural power of a word. And so in the Bible, in the Old Testament, it was originally translated into Hebrew, and the New Testament into Greek. And so looking at the Old Testament Hebrew meaning of the word, it literally means a word is a thought capsule, or said another way, an intent container. And so in every word, I think that's such a cool picture, in every word is encapsulated the intent or the thought of something. And so at least in terms of God, what I was interested in is what was the original intent? What was the original thought? And so there actually is a history of that. It's very easily, I wouldn't say easily, but it is knowable and you can trace it back. I know when I started this journey, I thought it was going to take me a year to research and write, and it took 3 years to research and write, because following that trail, turns out to take a fair amount of time. But anyway, the point is this, that if a word is a thought capsule or an intent container, when you look up the meaning of the word thought, it means to form something in the natural. And so, in other words, a word has the power or intent infused in it to form something that word intended in the natural. And so why that's critical, in fact, when you look up in the Hebrew text, and it's referenced in the New Testament as well, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Now, how can there be a word before we actually describe God? Because of what a word is. A word in the beginning was God's intent, God's thought to form something outside of himself. And so, in reference to that, God could say, let there be light, and the Bible says there was light. Because in his word was his intent to form something. Mm-hmm. And so why this matters, if you looked at the 9 words, there were originally 10, but I combined 2 words, as we'll talk about briefly in a second, into one chapter. But if you look at these 10 words, what was their original intent? What were they intended to form? And so if you, for example, call an ecclesia, which was the Greek word that is in modern translations translated church, if you call it a church, what will you form? Churches. But what if an original ecclesia didn't look anything like what we consider a modern church to look like? If you change that original intent, you change everything. Which is why, in closing on this part, it was so critical that in the story of Adam and Eve, for example, in the book of Genesis, the very first thing that the adversary asked them is, what did God really mean? What did he say when he told you this? Why? Because if you ever wanted to obscure or distort what God originally intended to form on earth, as it is in heaven, the first thing you would have to do is change the meaning of the words he used to describe it. And so culturally, this has huge ramifications even in our modern times. Because when I say the word love, sin, religion, church, Christian, disciple, gospel, saved, faith, right? These words are loaded with 2,000 years of tradition based upon the way we've defined them, and they begin to form things in people and form things in the way we approach life and do life. That's powerful. However, if you discover a different meaning to that word, when I say the word sin to you, people, because of years of tradition, that forms in them a thought of what that means. But what if that intent that it's forming, or that thought that it's forming, was wrong?
Mm-hmm. Right.
You see what I'm saying? It begins
Yes,
to
absolutely.
change everything. I describe in the book, it's like all people have done this, probably as a kid. It's like pulling on a ball of yarn, and you just start to pull a little bit of it, and all of a sudden everything begins to unravel, or a thread on a garment. And that's how I felt. I didn't start to write this book because I was trying to prove someone was wrong. In fact, it's the total opposite spirit of the book. It wasn't to create division about who's right and who's wrong. In fact, it was just the opposite. The spirit of the book was to create unity around some really concrete, definite meanings of things so that we could be more unified, not
And
more divided.
how successful have you been in creating unity with the book, Kevin?
Reorient in circles, it's like dropping a nuclear bomb sometimes. And so, the majority, honestly, we prepared, because we're taking on, obviously, established traditions. I was prepared, for backlash. Because, hey, listen, I'll say personally for myself, I didn't write this with an agenda. I was a curious seeker, discovering. And over 3 years, there were many times, the sin chapter, which is one of the hardest, and for me anyway, personally, to write, because there's so much tradition around that. I spent 9 months, probably 8 months, just thinking about, researching, and sitting on that chapter, because everything I was discovering seemed to betray everything I thought I understood about it. And so your mind has grooves in it that just keep wanting to go back into that pattern. When I heard the word sin, it created a visceral reaction in me of what I thought that meant. But that reaction didn't line up with what I was discovering it meant. And so it literally took time, like a barrier in my forehead, for a while to go, wait a minute, that's not what that means. Right. And so anyway, I totally understand and have massive grace for anybody who reads this and goes, wait a minute, this guy's a heretic. I get that. I don't take it personally. I felt the same way when I read this. Your first reaction when you discover something that isn't as you believed is unbelief. And so it's okay. The majority of the feedback has been amazing. I would say 90% has been amazing. It doesn't matter whether it's been religious leaders, pastors, or lay people in the community, or some of my friends who are atheists. To them, this explained much of why they chose to become atheists, because there were just disconnects between what they felt in their core and what they were being taught, and this helped connect some of those dots. And so, yes, are there detractors? Are there critics? Do I like that? No, but there are, and that's okay. I get that.
Well, any author will have detractors and critics. Even as a professional blogger, we get what we call trolls in our comment section who are anonymous. The trolls, right? They're anonymous, and they poke at you, and it's really annoying and hurtful. But I think anybody who writes is brave, and especially you for taking on the topic. But I have one more question.
You always say, don't talk about politics or religion, and reorienting these words affects all of those realms in a significant way, and so these are hot topics for people to understand.
Absolutely. So tell people where they can get the book, and then we will postpone our conversation for our next week's regularly scheduled Hangout on Air.
All right, fun. I hope we can join some people in next week and do some question and answer. This will be fun. I love this new Google Hangout. I know it's been around for about a year or so. I haven't used it that much, but I like it. It's a neat format.
That's cool.
So you can get the book at thereorientbook.com. The book came out this last year. It's been available in a fully unabridged version, which is the 650-page version, hardback, on the website. It'll be in the trade, hopefully, this fall. Book sales or trade book sales are similar to garments or traditional retail. People buy in the fall for what sells next spring or the following, and so the trade sales are lagging a little bit behind, but we're hopeful that it'll be in bookstores. Maybe a slightly reduced version in size, but we'll always have the limited edition hardback. In addition, by the way, to the book, I'd like to show very quickly, maybe in closing, how the book is laid out, and then when you go to the website to get the book, what additional resources are there. And so the book is called Reorient. You'll see an uprising. I don't know if you can see that, but the point is that you'll see was a very specifically chosen phrase. Everything about this book, there's so much in the construction, which we can talk about later. There's all kinds of hidden little Easter eggs in here. But there's a lot of detail that went into the design, construction, and the way we produce the resources, because the goal is that you would no longer need me or a single individual to equip you with these things, that you would have all the resources to do it yourself, wherever you are, in your daily life, your realm of influence. And so we started the book with a survey, and we surveyed around 3,000 people. A statistically relevant sample would be 300, but we surveyed 3,000 people, and we simply asked them the question, when you see the word love, we asked them, what comes to mind? Is your reaction positive, negative, or neutral? And what do you think the word means? And so, based upon the responses that we got, we actually show you statistically what those responses were, what people thought. What's the first word that came to mind when they heard the word love, for example? Now, why is that important? Well, based upon what we just discussed about the supernatural power of word, it doesn't matter what this word really means. What matters is what people think it means.
I love that. Yeah, that's awesome. I love that.
So just because you said it doesn't mean there's been any communication or understanding. And so this is really important to see. And then we show, the next section is called Rediscover, which is where you rediscover the original, just pure definition of the word. And then we have a section called Recount in every chapter, which shows an infographic of the biblical use of the word in Hebrew and in Greek, and it shows you kind of a heat map of the emphasis. Now, love is a very prominent word, but it'll be interesting, for example, when you get to the word Christian, which we think is a very prominent word, to discover it's actually only used in the Bible one time, and never in the context that we think. And so these infographics become powerful. And then once you've we've revealed what people thought, we've rediscovered what it means, we've reconsidered it in a new context, we've recounted the biblical emphasis that the biblical writers or Jesus placed on it, then we begin to reorient based upon that. And what we endeavor to do in Reorient section is take on what are the primary traditions and things that have been formed around the popular definitions of these words as compared to the original. And then the last section, or last two sections of every chapter, is a resolve section, where we resolve, once we've reoriented, to use it differently. We like to say, change the way I think, change the way I act, change the way I speak, and then be the change that you want to see based upon these. And then we have a section called Relate, which is an exercise where you can learn and practice to relate to the word differently. And I can't underscore enough how important that is. I mean, it took me, like I said, 9 months, even after I had rediscovered or reoriented to the definition, for example, of sin. It really did take me 9 months of kind of retraining the mind that I had built up around that word to think differently about it and act differently about it. And so, and then with every chapter, we wrote original music, and there's a song that we feel like encapsulates, at least in the words that are used in the song, what the meaning of that word, reoriented meaning of that word is. And then we also include on the website, there's over 100, I think, maybe 75 to 100 free resources. So all of my notes, all of the verses that I had to go through to research this, we've made available for you for free on the website. So you can just log in and download, so you don't have to do that research. But the thing I want to stress is this. You, Jayme, or anyone, I say this everywhere we go, don't take my word for anything we've said in this book. I'm a man. I could miss it. I could be wrong. And I have biases. I have life experiences that try to influence. I try not to let those enter into this. I try to, reorient my experience to match these original intents, not put my experience into them.
Right.
And make them meet it. But my point is, I'm a man. I could probably miss that. And so you don't need to take my word for it. You have all the verses. You can go back and check it for yourself. Absolutely. Right? And I think that's a really important thing. So I've tried to make those resources available on the site. And then lastly, once you've read the book, once you've gotten the resources, if you feel like you want more, we provide on a regular basis, different places around the country, 2-3 day intensives where we take, through the lens of the book, we try to take you further to not only understand it, but how to live it out. So instead of just understanding what a disciple is, what we would do in the intensive is actually equip you to become one. And so they're intentionally small. They're usually no bigger ever than 120 people. And so a level 5 or level 1 intensive is like 120 people. The next one down, level 2, is usually 70 people or 60 people or less. Level 3 is 30 people or less. Level 4 is 12 or 10 people or less. And level 5 is 10 people or less for 3 days. And the reason being, and I'll end with this and we'll wrap up for today, is that there's a greatness of smallness. And as you discover, Jesus only taught to a crowd a couple times in his whole ministry. And he never spoke openly to a crowd of people. He always spoke in parable form. And the reason he did that is not because he didn't think they could handle it, but he's so gracious. And when you're teaching to a crowd that you don't know, you're always teaching to the lowest common denominator. There may be children in that crowd, and so he didn't want to speak above them in a way they couldn't understand. And so in a crowd, in a big gathering, though that's fine, I love to speak that way and teach that way, it's not most excellent for making a disciple, because I always have to teach to the lowest common denominator. Where in a small group, where I've gotten to know people, I can teach to their level of competency. And you can talk more openly. And so you'll see Jesus say, he spoke to the crowd in parables, but then he would turn openly and speak to his 12 disciples. So he spent the most of his time embedded in life, equipping those people. And who would think that just those 12 people and one guy who never lived out of a 12-mile radius, Jesus, who never amassed an army, who never had a social network, right, who never had a physical meeting place, we'd still be talking about him 2,000 years later as one of the most influential people in the world. And so being a disciple of Jesus in that sense, if you want to do what Jesus did and make that a part of your very nature, you're going to have to reorient to the words he used and use them and act on them in a way that's consistent with what he intended until they're second nature. And so that's really the intent behind Reorient, and ultimately an uprising. As I said, this is the first in a series of 7 books called an Uprising series. And so the next few books are designed the same thing. Our focus at an uprising, we're not trying to build a ministry, we're not trying to build a following. We're literally trying to, when I write or when we speak or when I'm talking to you, at the end of every word is a single individual, human heart who has to learn to do this stuff in the context of their own life, in their own home, in their own circle of friends, in their own business, in their realm of life where they're called to represent the intent of God. And so everything we provide is designed to equip that individual, that small family, that group, to have impact where they are, not come to always where we are. And so that's the spirit. We're not trying to do anything else than equip that community. And we've been fortunate with the thousands of books of Reorient that's went out just by word of mouth to literally just sit back and watch, and I hope we get into that in these weekly calls to start highlighting what other people are doing. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter so much what I do or what I believe. It's what you do and what you believe that's going to affect your life and your realm that God's called you to. And so we're here to serve you in that capacity. I'm not looking to be served in any way.
I love that. Hey, Kevin, thank you so much for today. And again, everybody can get the book at thereorientbook.com. And please do look for more of these sessions on a weekly basis. If you'd like to join us, please find us on Google, Twitter, Facebook. We're everywhere. And we can't wait to talk to you again, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jayme. You're the best. Bye.